50,000 people used to live here. Now it's a ghost town.
The original Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare was absolutely legendary, but why? Why was it the title that changed everything? If you've played Call of Duty at all in the past 10 years, then COD 4 has had a massive influence on your experience. COD 4 is what is widely considered to be the birthplace of modern Call of Duty. Although the series did exist before the game, Call of Duty 1, 2, and 3, however, did not have the secret formula and the special sauce that made COD as a game stand out. It was just another World War II shooter until that fateful day, November 5th, 2007. This would be the title where Call of Duty discovered its identity. In fact, the sub-series Modern Warfare wasn't planned behind the scenes to be a trilogy. Infinity Ward were merely dying to make a modern-style shooter game, but just happened to be in the middle of making World War II shooters until they were finally given the opportunity to put all their new ideas into this project. But it was so successful, it would have been criminal not to capitalize on it. So why do I say COD 4 specifically was the birthplace of the brand? It seems odd that just this random installment would have such a large impact, but COD 4 was pushing the envelope with what was thought to be possible in the FPS market in that era. And many of us aren't even old enough to quite recall the atmosphere of the Call of Duty community. When the game released in 2007, I was literally 9 years old, and I actually didn't get around to playing this game personally until 2008 after World at War had already released. In fact, I didn't even own my own game console. Instead, I would have to play at a friend's house or my cousin or somebody in the neighborhood. It was my first real experience with Call of Duty in some ways. The only other FPS I'd played were Medal of Honor and Halo prior to this. So I spent the summer nights of 2009 playing World at War and COD 4 with my friends, being totally unaware of just how legendary of a game this would become. So, let's talk about nostalgia for a second. While it's easy to credit all the success to COD 4 as purely just that, a fond recalling of how simple everything was by comparison, thus inflating the value of that thing in question, to some degree, I think it plays a role here, but that nostalgia is triggered because something truly great was experienced. I say this all the time, but think about it. You don't have a sense of nostalgia for anything and everything back in 2007. I'd argue COD 4 was Call of Duty's first game to actually put them on the radar. Like for example, how many Bungie games can you name off the top of your head before the Halo series was made? They did a bunch of things before, but none are remembered quite like Halo. Similarly, Infinity Ward was able to grasp the attention of the gaming world with Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare specifically. Again, not saying games before it didn't exist, but this was the title that put an iron stake in the ground for Call of Duty as a brand. It was and still is the foundation in some sense, but with that in mind, it's impossible to hold the original COD 4 to the standards of gaming in 2022. And it's not that the game doesn't hold up with time, but everything by comparison just feels very quaint.
You get to choose your weapon, customize it with different attachments like silencers and scopes and grips and grenade launchers. You can put camo on your gun to make it look different, and you also get to choose perks for your class that you're creating.
Modern day games are supposed to have all these things just as basic groundwork and aren't features to show off anymore. The standard for quality has gone up astronomically in the gaming industry, which I'm not saying is a bad thing, but it meant for this review, it was virtually impossible to play the original game for the intended experience. You can't really play it on PC anymore, no controller support, I can't play it on older consoles, so getting the vanilla COD 4 experience that was, what we had back in the day was impossible to recreate, and Infinity Ward saw this coming, so they brought this game into a more modern day context with COD 4 Remastered that came out with Infinite Warfare back in 2016, remastered by Raven Software. Activision knew nobody wanted to play Infinite Warfare at the time, so they tacked on COD 4 as a pre-order incentive. So most of the relevant footage you'll be seeing will be from the remaster, but in this review, we're going to be talking about both games essentially. While they do have their differences, mostly when it comes to aesthetics, in terms of core gameplay, they're largely the same thing. So the remaster would come with a few more bells and whistles like loot boxes and such, but don't worry, we're gonna get there. So whether you played the original COD 4, the remastered, or both, I think you'll understand me when I say it's not that the game didn't age well, it's just that the game's core is still very basic and simple when directly comparing it to any Call of Duty in the past 10 years. And I mean that in a mostly positive way. It was accessible to everyone, which is why the game did so well, and it was light years ahead of the competition that it had back in 2007. In fact, we're all used to Call of Duty having 3 separate main experiences for content, but COD 4 only had 2. Campaign and multiplayer. Spec Ops wouldn't be introduced until Modern Warfare 2, and zombies wouldn't even exist until the following year. The game is a relic of the times, and while the content offered wouldn't fly in our current day, the waves of influence caused by COD 4 still resonate in game design even now. So, as much as COD 4 was pushing the boundaries of FPS games and finding its own formula with gameplay features, something I found extremely interesting, Infinity Ward mostly marketed this game for the technical advancements. It was touted as the most realistic and immersive looking game in the Call of Duty franchise thus far. Again, that statement and how the game looks now seems kind of hilarious to us, but COD 4 came out at a time when games would improve visually at an accelerated rate.
Well, it took time. It took the engineers this much time there on top of the old game. We just kept going, never stopped. And it was all about refining the lighting and refining everything we had to get it to work better.
Think about it like this. In the early 2000s, for example, huge strides were made every year to make games more realistic and immersive. Technology evolved, and there was a lot of room for improvement to begin with. You compare that to now, that acceleration has kind of topped out. Games look so realistic now, you actually can't even get much better. Sure, there are minor improvements every year, but at some point, the acceleration of visual improvement grinded to a halt, or at best, a snail's pace. It's the basic law of diminishing returns. And the main reason, they kind of hit the ceiling on what constitutes better visuals to begin with. But the original COD 4, when that acceleration of improvement was near its peaks, it genuinely was the best looking Call of Duty game at that time by a mile, and the remaster shows just how far graphical fidelity has come in the past 15 years or so. COD 4 was also the first game in the series to start using mocap technology for the character animations. Once again, mocap is the most basic tool for creating games now, but it was a selling point to market back in the early 2000s era.
The graphics are just coming alive in Call of Duty 4. Really had to rely upon motion capture. It's our first time doing it, and wow.
Call of Duty was also one of the only games that had this level of complexity, but still ran at 60 FPS. Again, that sounds so quaint or standard now. Games need to come out of the box at least 60 or it gets laughed at, but being able to pull off this level of detail, this many players, and maintain a smooth 60 FPS on hardware like the PS3 and Xbox 360 was a massive reason to choose this game over the competition. So the point is, COD 4 wasn't exactly selling itself on its new features and formula that we're going to explore the genius of later in the video. It was really pushing the improvement in graphical fidelity and technical innovation, but its legacy would be defined both by that and the choices it made in game design, the campaign structure, and so on. So join me today as we jump back in time to extract the real secret behind Call of Duty 4's success as a game.
Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare is going to be the best first-person shooter on the PC, Xbox 360, and PS3 coming out this November.
Hey, not going to take up too much time. Just want to say if you're enjoying, please drop a like on the video. It helps out tremendously, and if you're enjoying, make sure to subscribe to stick around for more. You can also watch my other COD reviews. I've done one for almost every single Call of Duty game at this point, so go check them out after this one, but just that's all I want to say. Back to your regularly scheduled program. The two masterminds behind the genius of the original Modern Warfare title were these lads named Grant Collier and Vince Zampella. While in current day, Vince Zampella is still head of Respawn Entertainment, admittedly much less is known about Grant Collier these days, but these two gentlemen took Infinity Ward and its staff of around 100 or so, full of ideas and experience to attempt a modern day shooter. As stated, they've only made World War II games up to this point, and they wanted to make a modern game right after Call of Duty 1. But as Xbox launch title deals would have it, they had to ship COD 2 as another World War II game, and then Treyarch made Call of Duty 3, yet another World War II game. So finally, IW had the chance to break the mold and put all their new ideas on full display. And these ideas were what gave Call of Duty its identity. For example, this is where the entire system of Create a Class was born. Create a Class now is fundamentally tied to the core COD formula so much that it would be jarring if a game didn't have it anymore. Also, the introduction of the contemporary killstreak system, probably the biggest reason this game did so well. The core gameplay of shooting enemies in-game now became both addicting and rewarding, but more on the killstreak system later in the video though. It also had the first ever iteration of the prestige system. Just like Create a Class was something that added a sense of progression and identity to the brand, and has been a part of every title since, or up until recently, I guess. And something I feel isn't talked about enough, the first game to have these real kill pop-up animations, you know, for doing objectives or getting kills in game. Technically, COD 2 had these, but they weren't done nearly this well until COD 4. While this doesn't seem like anything groundbreaking, I'd argue this in conjunction with the kill streaks is the very core of what makes Call of Duty gunplay satisfying, and they probably didn't even think about it like that. It was just a function of the new progression and prestige system. But all these things we take for granted in current-day COD were absolutely earth-shattering back in 2007. It was literally the very definition of innovation and advancement in every sense of the word. While I cannot personally recall what the sentiment of the community was like in the air at that time, as I was far too young, as far as I can tell, this game blew everyone's expectations out of the water. While not perfect, it was easily regarded as the best game up to that point, and from a gameplay and technical perspective, it was hard to argue with that. Infinity Ward also had plenty of external help in the form of military advisors, actual soldiers who were recently deployed, and so on, to get as much of the authentic feel as possible, while still being a fun video game. COD 4 as a project went through a lot of iterations. For example, the original campaign opened up very differently to the game we have now, starting out on this desert rooftop instead, and even the first mission of the campaign now on the boat in the middle of the sea was originally supposed to be the last mission of the game, on a harbor instead of the middle of the sea. Not only that, it was supposed to be the final confrontation with Al-Assad instead of Zakhaev like we have now. So my point is, COD 4 went through a number of redrafts, refinements, and rearrangements to create the finalized product, and I think they found the sweet spot with all of the content offered. Like I said, this game was a little more simple, so I want to start by diving into the campaign of COD 4, and how the characters from this story somehow are the same ones we're still playing in 2022. What precisely was it that made this campaign so beloved? Well, let's go explore that. The thing I find the most fascinating about the original Modern Warfare story is the fact that all the characters, imagery, and moments that are considered iconic now were not self-proclaimed to be inherently badass back then. In other words, they didn't overemphasize things like Captain Price, the ghillie suit mission, Gaz, or anything that is constantly referenced in newer Modern Warfare games. For example, Soap himself is such a core piece to the puzzle of Modern Warfare in 2022, but in COD 4, he was just a guy. In fact, he doesn't say one word throughout the entire campaign. They didn't use Soap because he was badass beforehand. They just needed a guy for the player to engage with and Price to deliver story exposition to. It was the player's reaction after the fact that made people think Soap and Price and Gaz were badass. COD 4 also pretty much set the structure of every single Modern Warfare campaign ever, and that includes the reboots. You have a few different villains, a few factions that have interconnected conflicts, and you jump all over the place, zooming from location to location and playing as someone else. Infinity Ward, specifically with this subseries, have never had the most airtight plots, genius level character writing, or anything like that. While the stories and characters are good, however, the Modern Warfare games typically shine from the unique gameplay situations and variety in level design. They don't tend to dwell on one thing or one place for too long, and that makes them easy to play through in one sitting. And while the story of COD 4 isn't really much of a thinker, it's fairly straightforward in terms of like character depth and plot detail. That's why it works. It's not trying to be something it isn't. COD 4, in fact, has a completely silent player-protagonist approach, and it works great here. I gave Ghost a lot of grief for its silent protagonist, but why doesn't it work in that game? Because Ghost was much more of a character-driven story, and Modern Warfare just isn't. Price, Gaz, Soap, Sergeant Paul Jackson, and so on are essentially just vehicles for the plot to unfold. But the funny thing is, we love these characters because they weren't asking to be loved. I'd also like to point out, this game's got some real teeth to it. It still, uses real videos and images to deliver its story occasionally. While not nearly on the same level as like Treyarch games, using real images certainly helps to ground it, and the player doesn't have to suspend their disbelief quite as much. Also, the characters can die in just very brutal, matter-of-fact kind of ways. Finding that balance just right between realism and fun game design is literally an art form.
Look at this place. 50,000 people used to live in the city. Now it's a ghost town. Never seen anything like it.
Now, let's quickly talk about the plot. So, basically, you have a Russian ultranationalist named Zakhaev, and what is, for all purposes, a dictator in the Middle East by the name of Khalid al-Assad. They're working together in the form of weapon exchanges and such. Zakhaev is supplying al-Assad with nuclear arms in exchange for support. So, it's up to the SAS to hunt down and stop Zakhaev, and the US Marines are going after al-Assad. Pretty straightforward premise and setup for your bad guys. The opening is also super strong and grips you right away. You get a lot of great world-building stuff as you momentarily play as President al-Fulani, where you have to watch the state of your nation crumble under the takeover of al-Assad. The car ride is kind of long and allows you to really absorb your world, and the tone is set right away. Then you get taken out of the car, and you see both Zakhaev and al-Assad in cooperation. Zakhaev hands him the weapon that he uses to execute the president and claim leadership. There. Banger opening that makes you hate the bad guys, as is kind of required for stories like this. But before we continue with the story, I want to draw your attention to something in the gameplay. Again, this is a relic of the times. Training sequences and campaigns now are really outdated. They're boring, devs don't even like doing them, but they feel like they have to in order to get the player comfortable with the mechanics. And this one is literally as basic as it gets. It's a training sequence with targets. There's other games that do its training without you even realizing it, but this is not one of those games. People have made their own mini games specifically as a spin-off of this training sequence alone, but that's not really the point I'm making. In fact, I think the first few missions themselves are actually good enough as training sequences, and you could just cut this part out entirely. I mean, there's some kind of fun character stuff in here, but ultimately feels very disconnected from the rest of the game.
Right. What the hell kind of name is Soap, eh?
There's
So anyways, the majority of this game and its storytelling are told in the classic A-B style format, where the A story is Price, Gaz, and Soap going around, meeting with their informants, gathering information on the whereabouts of Zakhaev, attempting to apprehend the dangerous nuclear weapons or, find out where they're being produced without starting some kind of global war. Very undercover in their approach, and each mission has that kind of undertone. The opener mission on the boat, the house invasion, etc., and then the B story is the US Marines, and more specifically Paul Jackson, just another regular soldier doing what they can to put a stop to al-Assad's forces and eventually take him out. So most of the missions involve cutting back and forth between those two situations and learning that both Zakhaev and al-Assad both have second-in-commands, combined making them the Four Horsemen with their motivations properly established. Honestly, the villains themselves don't get terribly much screen time, which is probably the biggest sin as it relates to this story. Al-Assad is present way more than Zakhaev, and you never really get to see them in-game anywhere besides a few close encounters, but allow me to come back to gameplay for just a second. I'm not gonna lie, the gameplay itself is where the Modern Warfare campaign really shows its age. Its wrinkles and crust are on painfully full display sometimes. There are extremely awkwardly paced moments in the sequences sometimes.
Yeah. Score 1 for military intelligence.
Come on, we need to get moving before the search parties get here.
Why did he say that so weird? Gameplay can be very basic as well, and the red barrels in this game, God help me. I hate these with a burning passion. They are so incredibly frustrating. I understand their purpose, but they really do not belong in this kind of level design. But worst of them all, the technology that they would use for the AI logic would very often cause level-breaking glitches if an AI happened to get stuck somewhere. This would occur both in the original COD 4 and even the remaster. By their own admittance, the AI logic is the weakest point of the technology they had. This would contribute to strange pacing and downright broken levels a lot of the time.
Get to cover!
Interesting to note, a lot of people think that campaign levels are designed first and then MP ones, and sometimes that's true, but in COD 4, from my understanding, MP maps were actually completed first, and they literally just used the same layout a lot of the time for the single-player missions, albeit a little bit altered occasionally, but largely the MP maps and campaign levels are identical. In more modern Call of Duty, MPs are inspired offshoots from campaign levels, usually not one-to-one copies or recreations, but that really isn't much the case here. There's also some really dated moments in the dialogue and level design. Again, kind of cute or awkward now, depending on how you look at it, but it was par for the course in that era of time. Now, back to the story. Eventually, this wild goose chase for Al-Assad comes to a point where, nailing down the supposed location of him, some complications arise as you send your US Marines there. You have to go back to save some downed squad mates, but then a nuke gets set off.
Attempting to disarm. I repeat, we have a confirmed nuke. Everyone hang on!
Wiping out a really large amount of Marine forces. I love this segment from a storytelling perspective, the absolute dread of knowing that you lost all your squad mates as they succumb to the nuclear blast, and then eventually yourself. It really soaks in like, damn, we actually just lost. And it really lets that moment impact the player, thus raising the stakes for the rest of the game and making it that much more meaningful. Paul Jackson at this point is KIA, and now the player is only in control of SOAP or occasionally a flashback mission with Price. So basically, with some intel from your boy Kamarov, you've pinpointed Assad's true location to hold him responsible for the nuclear detonation. You find him in a barn, interrogate him, his phone rings, and Price picks up and immediately executes Al-Assad. Because it was revealed at this point Zakhaev was the one who was responsible for supplying it. This takes us to a flashback mission playing as Price and following Captain McMillan in probably the most famous mission in all of Modern Warfare, All Gillied Up. This is also the most experimental level in the game as well. Infinity Ward had stated that they were on the fence about doing this in the first place, and for a long time, the level was a mess. The AI didn't work properly, and it was a buggy disaster. It could have very well never made the final cut, but they got it to a, mostly working state, and now this is many people's favorite mission in the Call of Duty franchise. But anyways, as this mission unfolds, you make your way through post-nuclear incident Chernobyl, and the atmosphere and tone is haunting even to this day. It's so easy to pinpoint how this mission feels, like you know it if you've played it, and it's paced so well. Each piece of dialogue is for a reason, and the world around you feels really believable and authentic. Well, mostly, that is. Bruh. And through this, it's revealed to us that Price and Captain McMillan were attempting to assassinate Zakhaev around Chernobyl during a deal, with him being vulnerable and in the open, hitting him with a sniper shot from an absurdly long distance. You hit him, but he ended up surviving this attack. So, with the death of Al-Assad, all the Zakhaev fanboys are now coming to claim him, and you have to battle them off until some exfil is able to arrive. But you still need to locate Zakhaev, and the way this is done is through his son, Victor. Again, all the little details about like how they got there, how they knew Zakayev's son would be a surefire thing, and little details like that just aren't really that important. Once again, it was never an airtight plot or a genius level story, but a fun experience nonetheless. This mission, you disguise as the enemy and prepare to ambush them. A chase through the streets goes on as it's imperative you take Victor alive, but when cornered and with nowhere left to run, Victor does the job himself.
I can put one in his leg, sir.
No, we can't risk it. Hold your fire. So, take his weapon and restrain.
Мы все равно все скоро сдохнете. They've got some issues.
So that falls through, but raises the stakes higher because Imran Zakayev will now blame the US and British forces for the death of his son. So now the clock's really ticking. In your attempt to shut down the missile sites under Zakayev's control, a missile gets launched that's headed straight for the US and will result in a ton of casualties. Thus, the actual ticking clock element is now in play, and the stakes are at an all-time high. It's absolutely the peak of the story. You fight heavy resistance through the bunker, and when you make it to the control room, you're able to upload codes that disarm the missile before it's able to strike and detonate.
Stand by for confirmation. Stand by. Stand by. Bravo 6, all warheads have been confirmed destroyed in flight. We got a ton of debris, but most of it's landing in the ocean.
So, a massive crisis is averted, but that doesn't solve the problem still of Zakayev. As you're escaping the facility, you're ambushed by Zakayev and his forces in the final confrontation on the bridge. In the final moments, Zakayev kills Gaz with no remorse and is cleaning everyone else up. When Price slides you a weapon. This is without a doubt a real satisfying moment to conclude this story, and something I had noticed, because they weren't necessarily planning on sequels, all the threads are resolved by the very end. Think about some of the newer campaigns, they aren't closed off as neatly because they're leaving room for more games. Not saying it's a bad thing all the time, but you get my point. The story is written to be self-contained here. Of course it works with a sequel, but it's also just as enjoyable as a one-off story. Like I said before, this was never the most intricate or mind-blowing sequence of events. It was a story in service to the experience that is the overall package. That is to say, they built a good game first and attached a good narrative to complement it. So that combined with the, locations and visual variety and gameplay situations is classic Infinity Ward masterclass. It's also a very good campaign, don't get me wrong, but I guess my only complaints are it feels extremely dated now, even when playing the remaster. Like, my gripes are mostly to do with the technical aspects and some awkward moments here and there, but I really do like how in the remastered version, the missions are separated by act. That's a really nice touch. And also, COD 4 had plenty of intel to find, and in doing so, you can apply certain conditions and cheats to change the experience, for example. Also, for some reason, COD 4 Remastered ends in a Call of Duty rap. I'm not kidding.
Hand up, yo, shout out to Price, the one-handed bandit maker. Gas and Vasquez, disbanded any takers. If there's anyone greater, then show me. If not, then blow me. You can label the hater for side talk, I dub it solely.
As a complete package, it was far ahead of the curve in 2007. In modern day, its age is certainly visible, but that doesn't make it unplayable by any means. It was also a much longer campaign than I remember. Some missions are total filler, meaning they don't really push the plot along, which is just so they can have more locations, and that's fine, I guess, but I think the real secret behind what made it legendary was the fact that it was not trying too hard to be liked. All the characters come across so effortlessly, and same with the gameplay. It's like, here's what our game is, take it or leave it. It's not pandering or fan servicey at all. It just wanted to be a fun game with a story to invest you in the moment, and I think it does a pretty good job at that goal. And I often say that a COD's campaign, generally speaking, is the foundation for the multiplayer, but in this case, it kind of is the multiplayer. There's a lot of shared mechanics and maps, obviously, but now it's time to get down to the juicy part. How was COD 4's multiplayer really the mode that established this game in the hearts of many of us? I wonder why exactly.
Lock and load.
Let's get to it. I like to say that Modern Warfare 2's multiplayer had its work cut out for it back in 2009. All it needed to do was advance on this formula, but COD 4 was the creator of the formula itself, as it were. Don't know how else to emphasize it, this is where Call of Duty's core gameplay was born. With the introduction of all the new features, this became the bedrock for the decade to come, but these were all introduced at the same time, giving an astronomical amount of evolution compared to its older counterparts, and the thing is, it worked. People absolutely fell in love with this game, from its maps to its guns, kill streaks, perks, prestige system, and so on. The advancements compared to Call of Duty 2 were incomprehensible. They weren't kidding when they said this was the best thing Infinity Ward had made up to that point. Now, as being the first real draft of the COD MP formula that we're all very familiar with now, it has some clear, sharp edges, we'll say. Some things in this multiplayer are totally broken, entirely useless, or just downright comical. Like, I still find it hilarious how eavesdrop is a real perk. This lets you hear enemy microphone voice chatter. Yes, like in-game mic chatter.
Come over here. Come over this fucking wall. I dare ya.
Sounds ridiculous now, but this is how it's explained.
Eavesdropping, so I can listen into the enemy's voice comms. So if I hear that they're trying to pinpoint my location, I can hear that, oh, they're tracking in on me. I got to move. So it's just.
When in reality, catching someone hot micing is not what you need to be hearing when playing the game, and this perk is really funny, but it does not serve the function that it was made for, and it is absolutely not worth, sacrificing a perk 3 slot for. It's just a lot of stuff like that, and just the balance of everything. Basically, all the good perks are in the 2 and 3 slot. All perk 1s are usually just extra of something. Things like stopping power, so you have higher base damage for all bullet weapons, was blatantly busted. Juggernaut for more health was also complained about a lot and just broken, but stopping power was the thing that counteracted it in theory. Most of COD 4's rough edges would be smoothed out in MW2, although that game had its own issues to deal with. I noticed when revisiting this MP that because basically every perk was busted, it encouraged you to actually build a ton of different setups depending on the situation, more so than I feel like a lot of COD games do. Like, you can run a class with the UAV jammer perk and a silencer on your primary weapon to stay completely off radar, but that means your damage output isn't going to be as high as it could be. That was also very apparent in the way that attachments were. There's not many at all in this game, and you can only pick one, but that choice would be a very meaningful one when it came to the purpose of your class. Also, pistols were pretty viable in this game just due to the way that guns functioned. You had no other choice but to carry a sidearm, like you couldn't forgo it for any reason, but for the most part, it gave you a lot of freedom to make meaningful changes to your class setup and experiment with things. Create a class itself was revolutionary, and COD 4 would have still been beloved just for that reason alone, but the big ticket item in my view were kill streaks. This is what genuinely set the game apart from the competition. Infinity Ward finally found their footing with the formula of earning 3 different streaks. 3 consecutive kills for a UAV, 5 for an airstrike, and 7 for an attack helicopter. That was literally all of them. The ability to customize and choose kill streaks wouldn't be a thing until Modern Warfare 2. It's a blessing and it sucks in COD 4. It's the easiest yet most addicting gameplay loop function they could have made, but the literal streaks themselves can get messy. For example, kill streaks kill stack, meaning you can use airstrikes to get a helicopter. Not a huge deal in COD 4, but that would prove to be a wild choice in MW2. Also, because helicopters are only 7 kills and they last pretty long, a lot of times multiple players would have helicopters but can only use them one at a time. The air for kill streaks could get really clogged, if that makes sense. And while there were some things, there weren't nearly as many options for dealing with kill streaks like what would be available in the following Modern Warfare 2. The kill streak system was absolutely genius. Basic here, but still incredibly smart. Let me touch on map design for a second. Remember how I said many campaign levels are the same as MP? And this is why I say they were designed for MP first, because if you took a campaign curated level and just gave it MP spawns, it would be an unbalanced wreck. Most, but certainly not all, COD 4 maps are really well balanced for COD 4 Sandbox and allow for almost any kind of playstyle. It doesn't encourage nor discourage any preference of play. The maps have very clear power points and positions to fight for, making certain spots favorable to hold down. You all know which ones I'm talking about. All the maps in COD 4 really follow this general structure, and some iconic ones like Shipment, the smallest map in COD history, were born here. And this was only in the remastered version, but there were some variants of the existing maps that had changes to its aesthetic, like Beach Bog, Winter Crash, etc. It had a healthy selection of maps, and there aren't too many outright terrible ones in this game. Most are at least playable or, pretty great. Map design from Infinity Ward in this era was absolutely dialed in, especially for the sandbox and weapon balance of the time. Also, the prestige system itself was so far ahead of its time, it's crazy. It gave players a tangible reason to keep playing, grinding and ranking up to earn continued cosmetic and bragging right rewards. The prestige system would remain largely the same in COD for the next decade. It has gone through some changes, but the bones have more or less remained intact. Sounds wild, but games didn't really give players any reason to keep playing until now. Everything you do grants you XP, so no matter what, even if you're not so good at the game, you play enough, you'll reach Master Prestige eventually. Prestige mode was a leap in innovation in giving people a reason to get invested. So all of these new features and, added bonuses were great, but unfortunately, one of the biggest pain points in COD 4 was also the maps and the nasty head glitches. So listen up, let me explain something. In older Call of Duty games, a player's bullets didn't actually come from their gun, or at least not in the technical sense. When playing, it appears to come from your gun in the first person view, but in reality, bullets actually come from your player model's head, meaning enemies can have just the very tip of their head visible and can still shoot you. Like, some of the head glitches were unbelievable and almost unbeatable. This was by far the most frustrating aspect to the core design of this game. Very easily exploitable with the map design and, how cover was built in here, and almost impossible to counter. It took camping to a whole new dimension. That and COD 4 initially ran off hosts instead of servers, meaning the host of the lobby would have a very noticeable ping advantage compared to everyone else, so it was a common occurrence to dominate and absolutely stomp out the enemy one match when you're host, and then get absolutely hosed down the next when you have a bad connection to the host. The technical shortcomings of this game cannot be overlooked. A lot of them were kind of smoothed out with the release of the remaster, but still, the head glitching is atrocious. That's something that would absolutely piss COD fans off had it been released in current day. But speaking of the remaster specifically, I mentioned how Raven Software took the liberty of providing the older style of game with modern game mechanics. Those came in the form of in-game currency and, yes, loot boxes. It goes without saying, I'm not in love with loot boxes as is, but these are pretty bad still. They added a bunch of guns to the sandbox of COD 4, really disturbing the ecosystem of that original game balance. While it doesn't outright break the flow of game, sometimes I die by a gun and I'm like, what the hell was that? And it's some weapon I've never seen before, locked behind RNG. There's also a scrap mechanic, which you get for opening crates to make things, but the earn rates on these and the tokens themselves are a joke. Generally speaking, you get 2 depot credits per game, give or take. One rare supply drop is 30 credits, meaning you need to play about 15 games for one rare drop. If each game is 10 minutes on average, that's one rare drop every 2.5 hours or so. It's a literal scam. Or you can just outright buy them with cash, which is what they want you to do. And you can tell that this was the baby version of that horrible, horrible menu system from COD World War II. While I can appreciate the positive element of making an old game more fit with modern times, this system also feels like defiling the grave of a classic game with grimy gambling mechanics. Not really too fond of that, to be honest. Because the game is obviously more simple in comparison and lacks the content of current day COD, I think it's a big reason it was slapped onto Infinite Warfare's Prestige Edition. I feel like it's just not enough content on its own, even in the remastered edition, to sell as a complete package in current day. The core gameplay is pretty solid and usually really fun to play, but it can get stale quickly. You can only get the same UAV, airstrike, and helicopter on the same maps over and over again before it starts to feel a bit repetitive. competitive. The remaster does a fine job at adding some replayability, but it's through mostly artificial systems. It doesn't exactly compete with a current day Call of Duty when it comes to gameplay depth and features, but it's still fun. I'd argue more fun than a certain title. Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare was a simple yet extremely effective COD game. I think the best way to describe this experience in a few words is beauty in simplicity. The game in its original form was already going out on a limb, and the remaster tried its best to make this kind of shooter relevant in modern day. Overall, the single player is very good. Not the best or even my favorite, but it's excellent in just being what it is and, establishing the base. Not trying too hard to be liked or being something that it's not. The characters established here would be the fan favorites and what people still hold on to this day. And the multiplayer was revolutionary for the FPS market and the COD franchise simultaneously. Who knows where Call of Duty would be without the influence of COD 4? While it's fairly basic when looking at it from our perspective nowadays, it did so much to define a generation of gaming. It will forever be remembered as a legend and immortalized as one of the juggernauts of FPS history.